Welcome learners, welcome to today's important session in which we are going to talk about detective stories. Before I begin talking about detective stories, let me briefly give you an outline of which program this course has been taken from. This course, which is entitled Short Story, DCE 303 Short Story, has been taken from a very, very famous, program, which is world-renowned program, which is known as Diploma in Creative Writing in English, DCE. Okay, in short, it is known as DCE, and it has got 6 courses. Okay, out of 6, today the course which I'm going to talk about is one of the elective courses. Okay, which is entitled Short Story. Today I'm going to talk about detective stories, and there have been many varieties of stories or types of short stories. And if you have enrolled for this program and you have gone through all the book blocks and booklet, you may be very familiar with this in this course also, in which which is entitled Short Story, where we get to know about the different feature characteristics of a short story, types of short stories, in which one of the blocks, talks about detective stories. So today I'm going to talk about detective stories. So let us try to understand what we understand by, detective story. When we talk about detective story, it's a type of, I would say, a fiction which revolves around the investigation of a very mysterious event, and a kind of a logical process. When I'm talking about the investigation of a mysterious event, this event could be revolving around maybe a crime. Most probably, in most of the detective stories, what we witness is that it revolves around the crime. That crime may be in the form of maybe a murder, or maybe in the form of, I would say, theft also. Okay. And which is given open for the readers also to decide. And there is a detective which plays very, very important role, and he plays that important role through a logical reasoning. So when I'm talking about these detective stories, so as I told you, it talks about the whole mysterious event, which may be usually a crime, okay, such as murder or theft, and it is also based on logical process, by which the detective really, solves this problem, And this narrative typically follows the detective, follows a detective who, through maybe observation or reasoning or deduction processes, uncovers the hidden truths and restores moral or social order. So here, what is important is, the fact that the detective stories is based on a kind of a mysterious event, and that mysterious event, is very mysterious. It's so much in that readers, they get confused as to what this event is going to talk about, And then there we have a detective who plays a very, very important role, and the role of the detective is to find out, okay, the mystery, and to resolve the mystery. And by resolving the mystery, he tries to restore a kind of a social order in the society. So when we talk about detective story, remember, 2 things are very, very important. One is the mysterious event, okay, mysterious event. The second is detective, okay, who plays a very, very important role. And when we talk about this, we also get to know about, suspense and atmosphere. These are 2 other, I would say, aspects of any detective story. Okay, it is full of suspense, and the atmosphere is also very, very suspicious, and it's full of mysteries. So people, like mysteries, and they want all these mysteries to be resolved, okay, to be solved, So when we talk about detective story, people get to know, and that it's very popular, and people get to know about the detective story. It's popular. Why? Because generally when we talk about detective stories, 2 things: okay, suspense and atmosphere. The whole story is full of suspense, and generally it is in our mind, the people's or readers' mind, that suspense which is there should be brought out to the public, so we get to know. And that is done through detective story. So in the detective story, that suspicion which is there, it is resolved, made public by whom? By a detective. So that is why, detective stories generally are, very, very popular stories, And even now, young kids also, if you ask them about stories, generally in the olden times what happened was we used to listen to our grandma or grandparents' stories, narratives. Okay, we would listen to them very carefully. Okay, even before going to bed also we would ask our grandparents and grandnannies also to recite stories for us. But nowadays kids, they are not at all interested in all those fables and moral stories. What they are interested in is obviously the suspense, okay, and thrilling suspense, I would say. Okay, so mostly, nowadays kids, youngsters also, they don't like to read, normal stories. They like to read, detective stories. That's why the detective stories are becoming very, very popular nowadays, Then when we look at the center of the interest of the detective story is not the sensational crime which people talk about, okay, but the logical reasoning that really goes into its solution, okay. So what do we understand by it? So when we talk about, the center of interest, we try to understand as to what could be the center of interest, okay, what could be the most important aspect of the story, okay. So generally people think that, there is a crime, okay, which could be in the form of a murder. Usually, detective stories talk about, murder. Nowadays we have, soaps, so many soaps coming up. People, even ladies in the houses, they watch soaps. They are based on murders. So mysteries, and particularly which deal with murders. So generally, when we talk about detective story, the fact of the matter is that, and particularly when I'm talking to you, the learners specifically, you should know that detective story doesn't focus on crime, remember. But essentially, the characteristic difference which really it is having is in the fact that there is a logical reasoning which is used by the detective to solve the mystery, okay, which is there. So that is the essence of a detective story. So the center of interest is, remember, not the crime which is committed there, but the logical process, the logical reasoning which is used by the detective to solve that mystery. Okay, that's very, very important. Now there are many, I would say, characteristics, but before talking about characteristics, let me talk about the genesis of detective stories, because it's very essential to know as to how detective stories came into existence. So when you talk about the genesis, the origin of detective stories, it goes back to, I would say, the 19th century, okay, and it was pioneered by none other than Edgar Allan Poe, okay, who wrote the first series of mysteries. So he calls the Murders in the Rue Morgue, okay, the Murders in the Rue Morgue, okay. And later it was popularized by Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, okay, series, and Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot and Miss Maple, okay, Maple mysteries, okay. So here, when we look at the genesis, generally, so people, when we talk about detective stories, so they are reminded of the fact that they had their forefather in the form of none other than Edgar Allan Poe, okay, particularly in the Murder of Rue Morgue, okay. He wrote, that is the first series of mysteries, which became very, very famous, and then followed by, Conan Doyle, and Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. So everybody's, that Sherlock Holmes is almost in everybody's, you can say, mouth, little while. So these are the, I would say, the pioneer series of mysteries which the detective stories began with, So don't forget that. Even Agatha Christie's, the famous hero, okay, Poirot, and also Miss Maple, okay. So these are the mysterious series which have come into existence when we talk about the genesis of the origin of detective stories. And there have been, two important characters, particularly when you talk about, Edgar Allan Poe's important that, series of mysteries, the murders in the Rue Morgue, okay. We have Dupin. He is the character. Dupin is the character. And Sherlock Holmes in Conan Doyle's The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes. So they have both, established a kind of a tradition which has been, dominant, up to our times. And they have based on, power of deduction, okay, which have been needed for solving any kind of mystery, okay. So remember, the difference between Dupin and Sherlock Holmes, when you talk about the differences between these two heroic, okay, characters, So Dupin is intellectually very, very brilliant, he was eccentric, On the other hand, we have Sherlock Holmes, okay, who is a very romantic, a personality possessed by a very scientific spirit, But remember, both are gifted with extraordinary power of deduction, which are needed for, solving a mystery. So when we talk about characters, and these are the detectives, okay, so a detective plays a very, very important role in any detective story. So when we talk about characters, okay, characteristics of, characters, remember, a detective plays very, very important role. So when we talk about, Dupin character or Sherlock Holmes also, these have created a kind of, I would say, intellectual, really a kind of a image for the detectives of the past. Particularly when you talk about traditional detectives, okay, so they are known as, very well famous traditional detectives, Dupin and Sherlock Holmes, both of them, And there have been a lot of detective stories, as many as 5, particularly the Adventures of the Speckled Band, that is written by Arthur Conan Doyle, okay. That is part of your syllabus. The Blue Cross, written by G.K. Chesterton, The Purloined Letter, Edgar Allan Poe, The Case for the Defense, and The Locked Room. These are the short stories, okay, detective stories, which are there for all of you in the syllabus, okay. Now, let me talk about the essential characteristics of detective story, because it's very important to understand, as to what are the characteristics, okay, on the basis of which, we, name or we characterize any short story as a detective stories. So there are as many as, I would say, 7 essential characteristics of detective stories. So on the basis of which we say that this story is a detective story. And those 7 characteristics are as follows. Number 1, the central mystery. The central mystery is the first characteristic of any detective story. Okay, central mystery, which is also available to us in the form of a crime. Okay, so usually a murder, or theft, or disappearance that needs explanation, you can say, is known as central mystery. So the whole detective story revolves around that mystery or the crime. That crime could be based on either maybe a murder, or it could be also based on a theft. So that is the first characteristic of a detective story. The second characteristic of a detective story is detective figure himself. I was talking about Sherlock Holmes, Dupin, okay. So a detective figure is always an intelligent investigator, remember, okay, who analyzes, clues very rationally based on observation, So a detective uses his observation, her or his observation, deduction to solve the problem. So therefore, detective is very, very important. Detective figure, okay, is very, very intelligent, has to be very intelligent. Otherwise, that mystery will never be resolved, okay, which people talk about in any detective story. So that's the second characteristic. So the third characteristic of a detective story is clues and red herrings, okay. These are based on, I would say, information which are planted to help or mislead both detective as well as reader. So some clues are given, herrings, okay. Some misleading informations are given in order to hide the truth, okay. That is herring, okay. And next is logical solution. The mystery is solved through reasoning, okay, not by chance. That's the logical solution. Then fifth is moral order, which is restored. Okay, justice or truth, okay, triumphs at the end. You can. And then the sixth characteristic is narrative structure, okay, which begins with the crime firstly, then investigation takes place, then there is a revelation, and then explanation is there. So there is a process, narrative structure. So firstly we talk about crime, okay. So if suppose a story talks about a murder which has taken place, so firstly it will be talking about the crime. And then investigation, it will talk about investigation. Investigation takes place, and then through investigation we get to know what is the revelation, okay, the mystery all about, Then there is a revelation, then finally explanation is there. And then final characteristic of detective story is, reader participation. So readers are always invited to solve the mystery alongside the detective. Now, what I'm going to do is now to, somehow illustrate these 7 characteristic features, with the help of story, okay, detective story, which is here written by Edgar Allan Poe. So 7 features. Let me somehow try to relate those characteristics with the short story and prove that short story is none other than a detective story. So the first characteristic which I talked about, okay, in a detective story was a mystery or a crime. So when we talk about the adventure of the Speckled Band, okay, so in this one, what happens is that we look at, a puzzling thing, happening, inexplicable crime, okay, which takes place, okay, that needs to be resolved, And the mysterious death of Julia Stoner, okay, is the central puzzle, okay. And her dying words, "It was the band, the Speckled Band," create intrigue and confusion, setting the tone for the investigation, So here, what is the mystery? The mystery is about this character, Julia Stoner, okay? And particularly the mystery, I would say, is revolving around her statement, okay? She is, kind of a hurrying, that word is being used, in order to mislead the people, mislead the readers, It's a band, it's a speckled band. So nobody knows what exactly she is talking about. People think that it's a speckled band which she is talking about, but that is not so, So suspense is created to the crime, okay? So here crime and the mystery is coming in the form of a statement which is given by none other than Julia Stoner. So that's how we come to know that it is going to be a detective story, because right from the beginning a suspense is created. The atmosphere is very suspicious, suspense, and people want to know as to what exactly it is going to happen. You can say who has murdered that person, okay, so that's going to happen. So that's the first characteristic. Now the detective figure, that's the second characteristic. So when we look at this one, this story, so there is a rational, intelligent investigator who is using this logic. And in this short story, it's none other than, Sherlock Holmes, okay, who happens to be a very, quintessential detective, who is using his keen power of deduction, scientific reasoning, and calm objectivity to uncover the truth behind Julia's death and protects her sister Helen, So here, I think that, there is no doubt about the fact that here the detective is Sherlock Holmes, So detective figure, when we talk about the second characteristic. So here, he is going to reveal the truth by using his reasoning power. His observation, his deduction, he's making use of his reason power, He's very, very intelligent person, Sherlock Holmes, and he's making use of his reasoning power, his observation, his deduction to reveal the truth behind Julia's murder. Julia has been murdered because nobody knows, okay, as to how she died, So he is trying to come up with a kind of, solution, by using his, brain, his reasoning power, and that is doing. So this is the second character, detective figure. And in this story, okay, we get to know that Sherlock Holmes is the detective. Now the third characteristic is, as I told you, clue. A clue is given, okay. Red herrings, okay, kind of which is used as a misleading thing, okay. So the detective fiction is presenting clues, okay. So here, in this short story, the ventilator, dummy bell rope, strange whistle, night, these at night, they serve as mysterious clues. Okay, ventilator, bell rope, strange whistle. A speckled band initially seems to suggest a group of ribbon, misleading both reader and characters until Holmes identifies it as a deadly snake. So here, what are the clues? Ventilator, okay. Dummy bell rope is, I would say a clue again. Okay. So these are the strange whistle. That is also a clue which is used. Then the next characteristic of detective story is logical solution. Now, in this story, the mystery is solved, you can say, not by chance, but through, I would say, reason deduction, scientific inquiry. Okay, so Sherlock Holmes is making use of, his observation, his reasoning power, and his methodically, examining the room, and he notices the ventilator, a bell rope, and finally he is coming up with his own theory, logical, or he is using his own logical reasoning directly to discover the killer, the swamp adder. He comes to know about the fact, you can say. So he's making use of that, okay. Then the fifth characteristic of a detective story is moral order restored. So here, Dr. Royal, the cruel stepfather who is planning the murders for money, is killed by his own weapon. And that weapon is the snake, and this poetic justice ensures evil is punished and innocent Helen is saved, So moral order is also restored, okay, through this, I would say, short story. Moral, that is the fifth characteristic, okay. And the sixth characteristic is the narrative structure. As I told you, crime takes place. There is an investigation which takes place, the revelation, okay, and then finally explanation takes place. So here, if you look at this story, in this one you'll find that, okay, crime is Julia's mysterious death, okay, and then investigation, Sherlock Holmes is carefully questioning, inspecting the stock, and the revelation is that Holmes' discovery of the snake, okay, and explains Holmes' final account to Watson Helen, clarifying the entire sequence of events, you can say, which is taking place, okay. And then finally, reader participation. So here, the readers are engaged, to solve the mystery alongside the detective. So there is a confusion which is created. Finally, the mystery is resolved. So these are the 7 characteristics, okay. Remember, mystery, okay. Crime, okay, some clues are used here, the detective figure is there, okay, suspicion is created there, okay, and the narrative structure is there, the reader participation is there. So on the basis of all this, we have looked at this short story and seen how all these characteristics are very much present in the short story, okay. A crime is there, okay, a crime is, that lady's, death is taking place, okay, investigation is taking place. Who is investigating? Sherlock Holmes is investigating, okay, and then he is also revealing the truth before us, okay. Now, so we find that this adventure of the speckled band, exemplifies the classic detective story, okay, through its structured mystery, and it's proving that this story is obviously a detective story. Now, let me try to differentiate between, kind of a conventional detective story and, contemporary detective story. So basically what is happening is that, when you talk about contemporary, story, this conventional detective story. So conventional detective story is always, related with the 19th century, early 20th century. When we talk about the contemporary detective, it's up to the 20th century to the present day, okay. So basically when we try to differentiate between these two, what you find is that, the rationale is used by the conventional stories. Rationale, okay, is used, okay. And in the contemporary, reasoning power is used, basically. So if you try to distinguish between these two, okay, the contemporary and the conventional detective stories, the distinguishing factor between these two types of short stories, okay. In conventional stories, okay, we find people making use of their logical reasoning, okay, that is there, okay. But in a different sense, in contemporary era, what is happening is that we find that, both the detective story is much more intelligent. Okay, detective happens to be much more intelligent. He is making use of his own observation. Okay, detective. Okay. He at times he's professional. Okay, and earlier it happens to be amateur, but now he is very, very professional. So in the sense, I mean, he is much more famous than detective in contemporary detective story. But so the basic distinguishing factor between traditional detective story, okay, and the conventional detective story is that earlier crime was solved, but on the basis of certain things, okay, which were at times not logical as such, you can say. But nowadays people use, particularly detectives, they make use of their reasoning power to solve the issue. So I think today's a lecture session talked about characteristic features of detective stories, and also sort of I try to implement those features in the short story written by Edgar Allan Poe, and try to establish as to how Edgar Allan Poe's story is a detective story. So I would suggest that please go through the blog and try to understand the features and relate it with today's lecture, which will really help you to understand about the detective story. So that's it for today. Thank you so much.